All right. Um, Welcome back, everybody. I do hope everybody's all coffeed up, especially for those in the Eastern time zones and on the West Coast who had to wake up really early. Thank you all for making the sacrifice. It's really great. This morning we were able to peak at 100 people. So in case you're feeling alone, just know there's 99 plus other people around here. I want to quickly pass this for the next session to Steve Haley and Ahmed Darmesh to talk about payments and policies. So Steve, take it away.
All right, thanks, Simeon. Ahmed, great to see you here. We've only got 20 minutes, so we should probably jump in. But just to say that, kind of funny, I wonder how many people from a life we were living 20 years ago would imagine you and I talking to a group of people about payments at the moment. There's a lot of things we want to talk about, and this is a forum that talks a lot about technology, and you're obviously coming at it from a policy perspective. And I love the fact that I can always bounce ideas off of you around how policy impacts our projects. So first thing before I get into any of that, let me just let you introduce yourself and you and CDF and what you do there.
Great, thanks, Steve. Really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks for allowing me to participate in the event. So Ahmed Darmesh, I lead UNCDF's inclusive digital economy and financial inclusion practices work on policy and regulation. I manage in particular a program we call our Policy Accelerator, which is looking at how do we do what it says on the tin, accelerate policy reforms in emerging markets that are focusing on financial inclusion, and particularly where governments are keen to leverage technology, whether it's mobile or otherwise, to have an impact in the various ways that it can. So what I do, or my background, I was previously a regulator in the UK, spent a few years consulting with Bankable Frontier Associates, really focusing on how do you look at the enabling environment for what at the time was branchless banking and then became mobile financial services and has emerged into digital financial services in particular. And we've learned a lot of things in the process, particularly this relationship between actually delivering technical assistance in a way that suits the needs of the regulator, because many regulators are starting from different positions. And I think one way to articulate the nexus of our work and a lot of the conversation that's been happening here is the distinction between policy issues and regulatory issues. And sometimes we confound the two. So oftentimes we find ourselves in a UN agency in a great position to be discussing policy. What do you want from this outcome? And then getting into this conversation about regulation. How are you going to manage that? How do you ensure it's working? What are the scheme rules and structures that you need to put in place to make sure that's happening safely and it's growing at scale? So, we have a strategy called Leaving No One Behind in the Digital Era, and it's really exactly that. So when you think about a policy context to say we want to make sure our growth and the development includes everyone, we then look at a regulatory context to say, what rules need to make that happen. And we have 4 buckets that we look at primarily, policy and regulatory being one. We look at customers themselves. Do they have the skills, the knowledge to be able to interact with these environments that we want to promote? We have an innovation work stream where we look at how are we helping innovators and innovations flourish. And then finally, most importantly, I would say, is we have what we call an open payment ecosystem work stream, which is really about, as we've all been saying, it's about the rails. What is necessary to allow that innovation to flourish? How does that set standards and clarity around what regulations need to say? And then how does it serve the customer? So that's kind of what I do and what we do in a nutshell.
Okay, excellent. And so, because you and I happen to have actually been in a room with a regulator at least once, and we've had a few calls with regulators together. Some of the nuances of the conversations that this group has around the design principles that go into designing those inclusive rails are frankly not the same level of discussions that we have with regulators, and that's not their job, and policymakers, and that's not their job. And what I'm trying to figure out is how do we bridge the gap of this really deep, intense thinking that we're doing and policymakers who have 1,000 different policies and a non-monolithic government entity that they're driving. And some of these nuances are critical for us but they are way too nuanced and way far away from the level of conversation we're able to have in those policy conversations. How do we get them to understand that level of understanding or that nuance about these decisions?
It's a great question, and I don't think it's an easy answer necessarily. I think, to put it simply, I think it depends who you're talking to, and are you talking to the right person at the right time in terms of, do they have the knowledge to be able to engage with you in this conversation, right? It's not, I want to be really clear to say, I don't think the way forward is to tell regulators what to do. I think the way forward is to create a dialogue where you can have an informed conversation about what their needs are, their values, their constraints, and then you can bring your technical capacities to say, well, we have various solutions for you. And again, sometimes the authority, the one who's making the decision, the individual, is not the person to be having that technical conversation with. So I think one of the perhaps ways of looking at it is just a series of gates that you have to make your way through. And in each gate, you may need to be prepared with a different type of dialogue. And I feel one mistake we make is we get too technical too early. Another mistake we make is we promise too much too soon, right? And I think the question really is about not delaying it, but to right size it, right? Like, are you having the right amount of technical conversation with the right person at the right time? And trust me, this is a balance, because you do want to communicate your capacities, particularly in the technology context, right? You want to convince them that their needs are safe in your hands. So I'm not saying withhold technical dialogue from engagement with government, right? But honestly, the simplest but not easy way to do it is to be really inquisitive, right? To ask questions. What are your goals? What do you need out of this? Can you give us some examples of where this has worked before? And if you have that type of trust, can you give us examples of where this has failed? We would love to avoid those scenarios going forward. I think those are the kind of conversations that you want to have with senior folks generally, right? To create that trust. And what often happens is sort of cascade of delegation, is that you end up being encouraged to speak to the right person. And then lastly, I think, and this is pulling from various experiences, and various countries will have different manifestations of this. I also think as a development partner, as a technician, you really do have to be prepared to cycle, to go back to the top and say, hold on a minute, we learned something. We just want to make sure you understand where this could be going. And then, empowering folks down that delegation sort of funnel to actually deliver that message themselves. Right. And I think, how are we building capacity of our counterparts in government as we go? And as we get further down the technical, or further down in terms of the delegations, like the hierarchy, but we're going up in terms of technical capacity, right? As we're engaging at that level, how are we thinking about building capacity? I think one of the elements that we run into is time. Sometimes we want the project to be done. We need the implementation to be done, have very little time to actually do the training, right? And to make sure that it's sustainable. And so that's a nut I don't think we have necessarily cracked yet. But I do think it's fundamental to ensure that what we're communicating to regulators is instilling confidence, making them feel like they're part of the process and it's not being imposed on them. But also, I think, to the point you kind of alluded to, it's honest and open enough where it's eliciting feedback, so where there's these inflection points. We're like, hey, as soon as we code that, undoing that is actually quite hard, right? And having the confidence to say that you all see that the same way, that point of no return. And by no return, I mean, it's going to cost another X zeros, right? To turn that around, or months, is really, you want to kind of that clarity. So it's really taking the strategic, inquisitive, question-oriented view first at the right level, making sure you're mapping the right content to the right person, and then be willing to revisit that cycle as you learn more.
I think that goes into a lot of the conversation we were just having around this agile approach, and this idea of, if you go in this iterative manner, then the first time you go around the circle, you learn something. The second time you learn something else. The third time you say, oh, that other person should be in the room too. Bring them in now. And next time around, those other 5 people should be in the room. Bring them in now. And you often don't know who those people are until you're way too far down the path. If you're going in a waterfall or like a driven process, and those people are just going to get left behind, or they're going to be brought in at the wrong time. And I think that's been a challenge that we've very often had with a lot of these projects is you can't get past that hierarchy person until you have a complete project. They want to be the one that often there's like this say, oh, well, I'll introduce you to the right people when the project is approved. Well, yeah, but we want their input in the project for the project to be successful. And this is how, but I want to get into what you mentioned about doing that training and making sure that the right people get the right training and not having cracked that nut. And I want to get your thoughts on something we've been proposing, which is, how about training by doing rather than training by presentations, taking policymakers through an actual process and through an actual project so that they can learn, oh, okay, now we're at the part of the process where we're working on the settlement aspects of this system. Who needs to be involved? Okay, great. You finally introduced us to the people who need to be involved. What are your thoughts on using an actual project for training?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the future of how policymakers need to engage with big investments like this, right? And I don't think governments in emerging markets are the only ones. I mean, you can look at, what we would more call, developed markets, spending tons of money on projects, some politician not caring how much gets done as long as the money is spent. So I think this is, generally speaking, a challenge between sort of technocrats and civil servants and all that sort of stuff. It's in a nutshell, it's kind of like how procurement is designed, right? And I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, because I think the power of having super clear policy, and particularly, at least, in terms of the ethos of what we're talking about here, what is the impact you're looking for, right? And in this case, mapping scale. We want a lot of people to use this. And for them to do it, they need to see value in it, which means it's got to be affordable, reliable, accessible. Thinking of those attributes and building them into it, I think, lend themselves to saying, okay, now what are the attributes that are going to make it as such? Rather than just saying, like, we're going to make this a design process. I think the challenge, though, is that the government need help in seeing design as part of their responsibility, right? Rather than something they delegate to a contractor. And I can't overstate that, because you get a mixed bag of folks that say, hold on, I thought you were going to do all this for me. So, well, it'll be better if you're involved. And so the question—
Hey, Ahmed, sorry to interrupt you. Can you say that sentence again? Because I think it was genius. Governments need help governments need help in understanding they need to be part of the design process, but you said it in a much better.
Well, I mean, I just sorry, it's always hard to, when you're in flow, but yeah, I do think governments need help to be to participate in the design process, right? I'm going to reword it now, right? More proactively, because more often than not, they're like, you're the contractor, I expected you to do this for me. And what we're trying to say is this will be much better if you're involved, because you will be responsible for managing it, implementing it, et cetera. It's very much a help me, help you type scenario. And I think the simplest way of doing it is coming up with, in a sense, a way of asking questions to make it clear to them that I need a little bit of your time so I can do this for you. The point of getting the higher ups in on it is really just, I've sometimes at the end of a meeting saying, is it okay if we have questions to come back to you? And really making that small gesture very, very, very clear. I don't think the way to do it is to go to a government and take some change management process and say, we're going to be design oriented now in how we do payments. That's not going to work, right? And we don't have time for it to work. There are some fantastic leaders in many of our markets who are pushing in this space, right? Who really do want to see more innovation in government. And I think when we hear that, we should be charging in their direction and giving them all the support. So it's almost not pushing too hard, but thinking about how we bring them along in the process. On the capacity point, I think this is hard because in most regulators, you have technicians and civil servants who have the training. It's the application that's the problem. And I think this is a point where I'm really excited about the work that you guys are doing. What we don't really have is models for how do you learn and build at the same time. And so to extract from the work you're doing lessons about where that works well, where that doesn't, how do you budget for that? How do you pitch that? How do you make sure you're having the right participation? And let me use an example. In addition to the skills, sometimes getting internal buy-in is really critical. So if you're working with the payments team, they may need to sell this to the supervision team, right? Because the data they need, because the layers they need, the access to certain infrastructure they need. And so you may make them really great at a payments implementation, but if they can't communicate internally the value of that, then you're kind of just running into another problem down the road. So when we think about capacity building around these sort of technology-oriented, infrastructure-focused, yet greater good type of projects, that internal sell is as important as knowing how to pull wires and kick tires.
I mean, as
sorry, lots to chew on.
No, I mean, not just a lot to chew on, but I mean, my closing point on the last panel was to say we have to make sure we have a successful implementation from a business perspective. Having it technically work is not going to cut it. We've got to be able to get a point to an example where we've said that's a place where it's actually working. And you've now introduced another thing that I think a lot of the people who have been working in Mojaloop don't understand is so out of our control. Is this part of the regulator and this other part of the regulator working well together to help us make sure that this goes to market in a solid way?
Yeah. And
that's just something we're not prepared for. So how can we, as our community of the community, which is still largely technology folks, I mean, how do we make sure that we're engaged? Just because we've got architects who can build the fastest system possible, how do we make sure that folks like you are there to help solve that problem? Because that is definitely not something we're going to be able to solve.
It's a great question. I think we have a lot to learn from sort of the advocacy world, where we're thinking about influencers and coalitions and people who are on sort of share a common vision and have assets to bring to it, right? I think oftentimes it's about timing, having these conversations early enough. I think also building capacity of your partners, right? I think what I love about the level 1 principles, for example, is they're super clear. The ethos is shareable. It's something that appears scalable on paper, but then as soon as you get one level down, it gets technical very quickly, right? And it kind of comes up against these intractable questions. I remember the first time, a shared fraud service came to mind. I'm like, brilliant. How would you do that, right? And it took me some time to figure out and understand examples and models. So a short answer would be, you don't have to do it. Other people ought to be helping you do it, but you may need to help them help you, right? How do you give them the tools to make the case on your behalf? And then, at that point, then you're looking at the bespoke context and specific individuals, specific institutions, and then you bring them into your process.
I mean, that's great to hear. And I'm glad that that's what you feel, because that's obviously why we've worked so hard to make sure that UNCDF is a partner for us. And so I'd like to close out with that, because we only have 2 minutes left. And Ivana is going to talk about the work that you guys are doing with Mojaloop in Tanzania, I think. But I want to mention this idea of how can we get regulators on this learning process. And one of the things that we're taking from the Myanmar one is that the microfinance industry there as a testing ground to say, hey, let's see if this works. Let's understand what we want by using the microfinance sector before we jump into this big piece of cake, which is banks. And how do we make sure that those lessons are actually picked up? How do we make sure that what we're learning is actually transmitted? Since UNCDF is our partner on that project, who's working on the policy aspects with the regulator, how can we make sure that we are extending that communication flow to the regulators?
I think it's a good question, and it kind of highlights how important communication is in the policy context beyond just the legal frameworks. And I think you articulated it well, right? In a sense, you're alluding to it is like it's first principles, right? So what are the fundamentals of this? And the MFI project in Myanmar, it's not about MFIs. It's not even about payments necessarily. It's about participation. It's about better competition, right? And so it can be about mobile money operators, as much as it could, CB Bank and Wave is just like microfinance and banking, I mean, how do you think about, well, let's reduce this down to this shared first principle. And then, and then you're just mapping it to their objectives. So it's like your broad economic development objectives stated by the president or the prime minister is to leverage digital infrastructure to be more competitive in the global stage. Great. So competition is a critical aspect of that. What we need is greater participation amongst participants and competitors. That'll bring prices down. Now, if that's on a shared infrastructure, shared standards, we'll get more usage. It'll bring prices down. People will use it. So by virtue of getting the MFIs in here to improve participation, competition goes up, more participation by users, et cetera. So you take their grand ideas, you scale them down to those first principles, and then you make it clear like this has greater value to you. That takes time. It's not going to happen in one conversation. You might not always be pitching it to the right person. But I think if you're always looking for that, you're heading in the right direction.
Okay. Thank you, Ahmed. And we have to close here, but I just want to say for all the folks out there who are implementing and realizing that, oh crap, regulation, I need to think about that. Now you've heard from UNCDF and you know who to reach out to if you want some help. I'm sure Ahmed has plenty of time to help you with that. So anyway, that's all I've got, Simeon. I think we're out of time. So appreciate, thanks for your inputs, Ahmed, and then hope you're a regular contributor to these in the future.
Hope so. Great. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks so much, Steve and Ahmed.